So I'm talking about increasing by a fraction every time, by a fraction of your amount, or decreasing by a fraction of your amount every time. And we did an example that I thought was a great example where you start out with borrowing $160, and somehow you con your way into paying off a quarter a month. And some people might think, okay, well, a quarter each month means you'll pay it off in 4 months. But in fact, you'll never pay it off if you pay off a quarter of the amount each month. So, how do you get the answer of never when it seems like four might be the answer? Well, what happens is in the first month, you go 160 times a quarter, which is 40. And then you do 160 minus 40 to get 120. Okay, that makes sense. All right, just three more payments and you're done, right? Well, you were sneaky and you conned your poor old grandma. So you do, okay, next month, grandma, I'm going to pay you a quarter of 120. So that's $30, right? So then you say, okay, now I owe you $90. And then the month after that, you say, okay, I'll pay you a quarter of what I owe you. That was the deal, right? I pay you a quarter of what I owe you. So I pay you a quarter of 90, and that's $22.50. And so then you take that away from 90 and you have $67.50 left over. So now I hope you can see how, even though you owe your grandma less every month, you're also paying her less every month. And those two values stay in ratio with each other. You're never going to pay off your debt this way. You will always owe something left over to your grandma. And similar to the last video with percent increase and decrease, there's kind of a two-step process where we multiply first and then we subtract it from the amount we had. Same as before, I can actually factor these two steps into one step. I'm going to jump that over here where I can factor it into two steps where I'm doing 160 times 1 minus 160 times a quarter. Now, where does that come from? That's because the process I just did was 160 minus 40. Well, 160 times a quarter is 40. 160 times 1 is 160. And same idea where this second step process right here is 120 times 1 minus a quarter, which is the same as taking my previous expression, because remember, this chunk right here equals 120, and multiplying it by another 1 minus 1 quarter. In other words, the second step of the process is 160 times 1 minus a quarter squared. In general, the amount that you owe your grandma is 160 times 3 quarters raised to the m for months. You could use x, you could use t, whatever you want. And this shows you that there's always something left over. Okay? So the payment that you get is the difference between any 2 months. But the amount that you owe is always 3 quarters of what you owed last month because you only paid off 1 quarter. Okay. So in the last video, it was talking about like a 5% increase or an 8% decrease. And if it was increase, you did 1 plus the percent to get your multiplier. If it was decrease, you did 1 minus your percent to get your multiplier. It's the same idea here. We're decreasing by a quarter, so we do 1 minus a quarter to have 3 quarters left over. I want to point out that if you ever want to know how much you paid, you're asking what the change is. And so that's always going to be taking 160 times 3/4 to a certain month and subtracting what was in the previous month, right? Or what was in the next month there. So you can do it 160 times 3/4 to the m minus 1. This right here is a little bit beyond the scope of what we really need to do in class. I mean, writing it as a general formula is, but in the context of a word problem, I would probably ask you something like, how much did they pay in the month number 7? So then you just got to figure out, okay, how much was in the account at month 6, what was in the account at month 7, and subtract them. And that's exactly what I showed you with this formula there. I'm going to do one more quick example with changing by a fraction where instead of paying off a quarter, let's say that your amount increases by a third every month. So let's say that you have, I don't know what's a good example. We'll just talk about moss growing on a tree. Moss grows on a tree and increases by a third each week, and it starts with, let's just say, 2 square inches of moss on the tree. So this situation here, we'd say, okay, 2 square inches times a third is, you could say, zero 0.6 repeating, but it's easier to just say 2/3 inches. So what that means is after 1 week, you do 2 plus 2/3 to get 2 2/3 square inches. But I hope by now you're kind of familiar with what's going on here, that we can factor that to be 2 times 1 plus a third, and that ends up being 2 times 1 plus a third, or 2 times 4/3. In general, the amount of moss that you have is going to be 2 times 4/3 raised to the number of weeks right there. And so the basic idea is the same, as like I've said a couple times. Multiplying by 1 keeps things the same. Multiplying by numbers bigger than 1 increases, less than 1 decreases. If it changes by a percent, you're thinking of 100%. If it changes by a fraction, you got to think about common denominators. So if I add 1/3, then I'm taking the 3/3, that is 100%, and adding a 1/3 to it. If it was adding by a fifth, I would just have 6/5 as my multiplier there. So anyway, one more video on this sort of idea that I'll talk about when the exponent itself is not a whole number.